Chapter 18 Bittersweet. One of the particularities of Obi-Wan Kenobi's personality was that he was of an exceptionally long-suffering temperament. He was a perfectionist, it was true, and was wont to complain when he or others did not measure up to his personal standards. He'd been a salted cynic from childhood, a trait that had only fermented with age. However, disguised beneath his furrowed brow, brooding and over-attention to detail, lay hidden the fuse to Obi-Wan's actual anger. The well to his aggression was a place so distant and untapped that most people did not know it existed. The fuse to his hinterland was miles long, and its incendiary point had only ever been reached once or twice in 2 lifetimes. A second particularity of Obi-Wan's personality was that, although he might not always look it, he was a man of deep feeling. Despite all training to dissuade it, he formed emotional attachments as easily as breathing, and could say of more than one person that he truly, deeply loved them. In the abstract, this presented many challenges to his orthodox Jedi philosophy. In the day-to-day, it presented a more immediate problem with his emotional control. Thankfully, he had an exceptionally long fuse to buffer his weakness, and the only people who had weapons sharp enough to cut the fuse to its quick were those that he loved and trusted most. Assured by the trust he'd always felt so mutually with his closest confidants, Obi-Wan had only ever had to face his anger, his real anger, once or twice in his entire life. Now faced with its ravenous boils, he grasped desperately at memories of Mace Windu's lessons in Vapad, anchoring himself in the light amidst the tumult. The effort was causing his hands to quiver, even as he raised his fist to knock. "Oh, hello, Ben." Obi-Wan answered the door, chuckling the name through a dimpled grin. Wafting from within the small apartment, the Force danced with the yellow-gold glow of light-hearted banter. Ben was unable to commune. "I need to speak with Master Jin," he announced in a clipped, calm tone. Obi-Wan's face transformed instantaneously, golden smile fading into an uncertain purple. There was no one in the galaxy who could have understood Ben's mood, except for himself. Obi-Wan had only to look at the man's face to know that something was about to break. The Padawan struggled to formulate a reply. "I know he's here, just show me in," Ben said to him. Obi-Wan complied wordlessly, shutting the door behind the master. He gripped his hands in helpless nerve as Ben strode into the living room. "Ah, Ben, I thought I heard your voice." Qui-Gon was watering his plants by the window, back turned to the newcomer. "You've come just in time to arbitrate a disagreement over Master Tarlok's technique of—" "I need to speak with you," Ben interrupted. Qui-Gon stopped his work and turned to see the aggressive calm of the older Kenobi, the nervous stance of the Padawan. Ben's right hand, just peeking out from beneath a voluminous sleeve, was shaking. Qui-Gon looked him in the eye, concern mounting. "About what?" If he inhaled too sharply, Ben's composure would crumble into ash. He took a very careful breath and said, "Fee more guard." Qui-Gon's face betrayed no emotion, but the muscles at his jaw bunched in shock. The Force's gold of before had gone stale, cooling to the color of a damp fog. Unbearable seconds ticked by, 2 masters watching each other while the Padawan stood by in awkward attendance. "Obi-Wan," Qui-Gon said at length, "give us a moment." The Padawan had already made a hesitant step towards the door when Ben snarled, "Why? Let him stay." Obi-Wan froze mid-stride, and Qui-Gon looked uncertain. He cast looks between the 2 Kenobis, one seething, the other confused. If Ben wasn't entirely mistaken, the men looked scared. Eventually Qui-Gon said, "Please, Padawan, just leave us for a bit." Thus commanded, Obi-Wan's curiosity was outweighed by his alarm. He took up a small portfolio of homework and left the apartment without a word. Disappointment and anger licked at Ben's mind. Coward. "I take it he's told you all about it, then," Qui-Gon surmised, crossing his arms to face his accuser. "He did." Ben's voice sounded louder than normal as he plucked across the tense lines in the room. "Which only leaves me to wonder why you never told me." Qui-Gon's jaw tensed again, twitching under his beard. Both Jedi were unused to this level of tension with anyone, let alone each other. Qui-Gon had to look away, and his eyes saddened when he said, "There was nothing to tell." The words alone would have bounced off the shield surrounding Ben's fuse, but flying off the tongue of the only father he'd ever known, they shot through and through, foregoing the buffer altogether. Ben snarled, "Bantha shisk!" Qui-Gon seemed surprised by the outburst and leaned into a defensive glare. What did he tell you? He told me that you were his master. You trained him to knighthood after his first master was killed. That you discredited him entirely because Xanatos fell. That's not true. Isn't it? What did you do then? Forget? Of course not. I pretend that Xanatos was your first apprentice and expect some sort of reward for lying. I acknowledged my own faults, Qui-Gon cut in, voice booming. He glared at Ben in silent reprimand for his outburst. After a sigh, he explained, Xanatos fell, you know that, and he did it because of my teachings. I could not let that go unnoted. I did what I had to do. Qui-Gon Jinn, vulnerable, was a sight that would normally have been somber and uncomfortable, but now he was too furious to let it register. Had to? Ben scoffed. You think far too highly of yourself, Qui-Gon Jinn. Xanatos would not have fallen or stayed in the light just because you told him to. His decision was his own. To think anything else is pure conceit. And you know so much about it, do you? Qui-Gon growled back. More than you'd think. Enough to know that it gives you no excuse to leave Femor by the wayside because of some stupid, arrogant brat. Femor was graduated by then. He was out of the way, Ben broke in. Gone from the picture, so you can do whatever the hell you want, as per usual. It did not affect him, Qui-Gon insisted. Not affect him? Ben repeated incredulously, a nasty grimace in place. The last thread of his fuse snapped away in flames. He was your apprentice, Qui-Gon. Of course it bloody well affected him. How could it not? What do you think he felt when he heard you'd written off his apprenticeship? Written him off? Tossed away years of friendship because of the decision of a violent, dark-siding boy? Qui-Gon said nothing. You didn't think, did you? The venom in his words was born of the irony, the pupil lecturing the master. Of course not. You're too wrapped up in your precious here and now to admit that sometimes there's more to life than the present. I'm not sure that you know, but to most people friendship is more than a series of moments to be systematically forgotten about. The past matters. The future matters, Qui-Gon. The fact that I'm here at all is a testament to that. Ben took a deep breath and let it out again in a huff. Force damn you, Jinn. I'd forgotten how obtuse you were. Yet, if Ben had taken a moment to consider, he might have wondered why Qui-Gon was being so quiet, why he hadn't attempted to take up the unrelenting offense that he'd loved so well when Obi-Wan was an apprentice. Why does it mean so much to you? Qui-Gon asked eventually, pained and angry. Ben listened to the rhythm of his own breathing for a moment, heart pounding in his ears, force running red. After shaking away the hottest core of his anger so he could see more clearly, he proceeded in a tone simultaneously soft, dangerous, and immeasurably sad. Because you wrote off the accomplishments of your own apprentice in a moment. Because you sacrificed years of friendship for the sake of an ungrateful boy and your own damn ego. Tears caused his voice to waver, but he would not let them reach his eyes. Because you did it once, and unless you are very careful, Qui-Gon Jinn, you will do it all over again. And when you do, there will be no one to call your bluff. The accusation sunk into the room like a knife into flesh. Stunned by the blow, Qui-Gon said nothing. Just as the blood began to well up, Ben added in the same eye-of-the-storm tone. So when Obi-Wan comes back here and asks you why you sent him away, you either tell him the truth, or you tell him to leave and not come back. Ben's eyes fluttered away from Qui-Gon, feeling he'd bared too much. It would save him a world of pain. Qui-Gon stood staring at Ben in unresponsive silence. Ben ran a shaking hand over his mouth and beard, hardly believing his own outburst. Unable to look Qui-Gon in the eye, he shook his head, turned on his heel, and stormed from the room. His frustration, embarrassment, and anger made his own movements a blur. After some length of time, Ben found himself standing in that ancient basement level once more, the stagnant, stone-cold air swallowing him and his anger in a static cocoon. He had not reached out towards the Force's calm waters when it stretched out a hand and snapped off the poisoned tip of his anger with all the care and adamancy of a parent. He took a shaky breath and let it out again, aerated uncertainty echoing off the vast chamber walls. A soft reflection turned towards him in the dark. Ben found himself in the room again in an entirely different way. "What are you doing here?" he asked Obi-Wan more snippishly than he would ever have meant to. It was uncanny. Understandable, but uncanny nonetheless, how the boy kept being there wherever and whenever Ben was there. Obi-Wan fumbled to stand, gesturing awkwardly with his datapad. Homework. It was obvious from his stance and his shifty eyes that he was uncomfortable. Handling personal conflict had never been a forte of his. Handling personal conflict with Qui-Gon had never... well, it had never been. Not truly. And definitely not via the uncharted conduit of his future self, who apparently had old scores to settle with his former master. Right, Ben said, and passed by Obi-Wan to lower himself onto a seat on the floor, back leaned up against the jagged slope of granite that had once been part of the floor. Obi-Wan observed silently for a while, and eventually said, What was that about? Ben looked up at himself. It must have been the question burning in his head for the past hour. I think that's a question best saved for your master, he said, tone suggesting unintentional contempt. Obi-Wan nodded with palpable hesitation. Did you want to go back to prod the beast? Ben read his expression like a book and reflected the sentiment in his own features. Did he want Obi-Wan to go back? I'd best be going, Master Kenobi. No, wait, Ben blurted before he could catch his tongue. Obi-Wan looked back at him, eyes begging the question. Tell him to leave and not come back. Qui-Gon, Did he trust Qui-Gon? Of course. Did he trust him enough to not lie to Obi-Wan? It occurred to Ben that, for once, it didn't matter if he trusted Qui-Gon. It mattered only that Qui-Gon trusted him. He'll want to speak with you, Ben finished lamely. Right, Obi-Wan said, uncertain as to the source of Ben's concern, but too puzzled to inquire further. Good night, Ben. Ben only nodded and waved a hand. Obi-Wan left his counterpart in the quiet and dark, wishing he could feel the tumult of Qui-Gon's pacing hundreds of floors above, to feel the gratifying balm of his remorse spread on the wounds that he'd inflicted. But the Force only smothered him again, inviting him to forget time and space, here in this sacred space, simply to be. When he left this place, the spell would be broken. But, too tired to put up a fight, he sat back and allowed his mind to run blank. Ben saw neither Qui-Gon nor Obi-Wan for several days. He did see Master Yoda, who had invited him to tea weeks ago. Communing with the Grandmaster on such mundane matters seemed to trifle amid the chaos of his mind. Disturbed you are, observed the old Grandmaster as he hobbled his way around the dingy apartment. Ben ducked under a low-hung light and knelt by Yoda's low tea table. Hurt, are you? In a way, the younger admitted. Ben knew it was folly to lie to Yoda. In this arena, evasion was the tactic of choice. Hummed his green interrogator. Many kinds of injury there are. Bad ones and good ones, yes? In which way are you, young Kenobi? I'm not sure. This made Yoda chuckle as he floated a tin of tea down from a high counter. Wise is to know that injuries both good and bad can be. He spoke as if to an invisible audience. Not wise enough to see both clearly? While they waited for the tea to steep, they spoke of everything, yet discussed nothing. Yoda prodded here and there, asking about Ben's studies, the future, but Ben evaded the inquiries expertly, reminding Yoda that Okara Che was already on his case and needed no assistance. They spoke of lightsaber combat and katas and how 9 months of dedicated solo practice would make him a better saber instructor than he had been before. If the council allowed him back, of course. Eventually, the topic turned to Obi-Wan and, by a matter of course, Qui-Gon. Ben was in exceptional control of his emotions, even when the matter came up, but Yoda was, if nothing else, astute to a fault. Bristle at the name of your old master, you do, the troll said, using the Force to pour their tea in an airborne dance. Ben watched the display sullenly. It is with the Force. The platitude was a farce on his tongue, because it was not with the Force, it was with him, forged into the deep valley between his eyebrows. Yoda's enigmatic hum encapsulated 1,000 words at once. He drank from his tea and sank contentedly into his seat. Ben prepared to follow suit, but upon tasting the brew his face twisted into a grimace and he choked into his cup. Master Yoda, he asked once recovered, looking at a small ceramic bowl with deepest betrayal. "What kind of tea is this?"
"Expensive tea it is,"
Yoda chided, as if reprimanding a tasteless youngling.
"Spit it onto my carpet, you do. Most rude."
"It's terribly oversteeped, Master. It's gone bitter," Ben said, sniffing the tea with an uncertain look. He blew out the smell and rubbed his mouth.
"Making tea I have been since before your ancestors were born. Oversteeped it is not. Drink too quickly, you do,"
Yoda said, taking a slow, snub-nosed sip.
"Too anxious are you to get to the end. Savor it, you must."
Ben eyed the Grandmaster with suspicion. He was, after all, talking to a creature who hadn't cleaned his floorboards in centuries and whose apartment smelled of moss and stale air. Still, with great reluctance, Ben lifted the cup to his mouth and drank. He willed himself to endure the bitter sting on his tongue and savor it as best he could. To his utter surprise, the tea turned sweet on his tongue, as sweet as if he'd laced it with the finest aged honey. He sat back in his seat, half in surprise and half in pure relief, swirling the taste around in his mouth before swallowing. "Oh," he said, mollified. Yoda chuckled into another sip.
"In its own world, Aniite, this tea is called."
"Bittersweet," Ben translated.
"Yes, good things sometimes wait for them we must. Fine tea master knows this."
Yoda took another appreciative drink.
"Make good Jedi, tea masters would,
He chuckled at his own joke. Ben took a second taste, bitterer and sweeter than the first. He watched the dreg swirling in the bowl, unassuming and unpredictable. He glanced up at Master Yoda and wondered how the troll was so good at hiding his seemingly boundless knowledge. "A metaphor," Ben nodded. "Point taken, Master."
"Metaphor?"
If the look of surprise on Yoda's face was artificial, Ben would never have guessed it.
"Not metaphor, this is. Tea, this is." Look for metaphors in tea, you do now. Brew too much, you do, as told you I have so many times."
Ben wondered distantly if resting and waiting were the same or only related. He took another sip and found the bitterness easier to bear. "Of course, Master. My apologies." It was the middle of the night when Ben opened his front door to find Qui-Gon Jinn standing on the threshold. It had been not quite a week since their confrontation. "May I come in?" asked the Master, who looked a great deal older than he had days prior. Unfamiliar rage had waned into that familiar breed of sadness indigenous to Tatooine. Ben stepped aside. "Of course." Qui-Gon entered, and the door hissed shut behind him. The two stared at each other in silence until Ben ventured, "Master, Qui-Gon held out a hand, and that small part of Ben that would always heed his master's instructions made him hold his tongue. "When Obi-Wan came back, it was very late. I almost let him go to bed without saying anything, but he said that you told him I wanted to speak with him." Ben crossed his arms deliberately. "And what did you tell him?" The wait was seconds and light years long. "Everything." Ben let out a breath that he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Did you really think I wouldn't?" "I don't know. You never told me." They sat down together in Ben's small living room, Qui-Gon moving carefully to avoid the growing wuxia and its leaves. "The fact that I didn't surprises me," Qui-Gon admitted as he sat. Ben raised his brows. "Had you planned to ever tell me?" "Well, no. But the Force works through us constantly. I thought that, should you need to know, the Force would prompt me to tell you." Ben actually laughed at the notion. "You are one of the Force's most stubborn disciples, Qui-Gon. Would you have been willing to listen?" Qui-Gon had the grace to shrug and say nothing. "How did Obi-Wan take it?" "As well as I might expect, which is to say not very well at all." He glanced at Ben's face, wondering if there was any residual resentment hiding behind the taciturn auburn beard. Though in comparison to his predecessor, he took it in stride. The memory of that night and Ben's unbridled anger passed between them unspoken. "I am very sorry, Ben, for never telling you. Telling Obi-Wan, that is." "It's not that you didn't tell me," Ben clarified, shaking his head and rubbing at his temples. I'm not truly that mad about Femor. It's just..." When Ben couldn't finish, he sighed instead. "What did I do to anger you so much?" Qui-Gon asked, quieter than Ben had ever heard him. Incriminating someone for their future sins felt like preying on the helpless. You abandoned me. Ben pressed on anyway. Set me aside for a promising young boy you wished to take as your apprentice. Qui-Gon blinked, not completely understanding. Abandoned? I hadn't yet graduated, Ben explained. You told the council you would train him. You were denied because of me. You told the council that I was ready for my trials, something you had never before mentioned to anyone, let alone myself. We hardly spoke to each other after that. Qui-Gon's expression of hurt was confused and disbelieving. And no one called my bluff, he recalled from their argument. Ben's chin quivered just slightly, and he had to look down at his hands in order to say, No, there was no time. For? You were killed. Ben was astonished at the calm with which he managed the words. You could not train the boy or me. I graduated without you. Qui-Gon sat back as if struck. By nature of Qui-Gon's death, preceding Obi-Wan's knighthood, there had been no official nullification of the training bond. It had shriveled away in Ben's mind years ago, after Qui-Gon had passed, but after lying latent for decades in a dead dimension, it twitched to life so that Ben could feel his master's heartache. 1,000 questions passed between them without words. We hadn't the time to make up before you left, Ben said, still refusing to look up. He remained there alone with his thoughts for several long minutes. He felt the couch beneath him dip when Qui-Gon sat down next to him. The man's palm on his back burned like a lightsaber strike, and the disinfectant poured on top. Ben, Qui-Gon broke the silence, I cannot claim that I am a different man, that I would never do that, because it would be at least half of a lie, but Thoughts on the importance of time, of the past, the future, and moments to be treasured presented themselves in turn for consideration. In the end, the Jedi Master was reduced to a place of humility. I am so sorry, Obi-Wan. Please forgive me, if you can. Ben did not think about the fact that he hadn't embraced his master since that horrible day on Naboo. But here they were, after 33 years, arms wrapped around each other's shoulders, noses squashed against ropes, chests compressed with the pressure that spelled out the invisible notes of family. Don't let it happen, please, Ben asked, muffled through the ropes of Qui-Gon's shoulder. It will break him without his knowing. Qui-Gon could make no promises, and they both knew it, but he nodded in the understanding that soothed all odds of uncertainty. The Force will present a solution, he said with reassurance. Ben only nodded. At length they drew away. Ben would have offered tea, but he did not feel the time. I have spoken with Obi-Wan, and with you. I suppose I need to speak with Femor next, Qui-Gon sighed. Ben made no comment, but as he lost himself in thought, a warm smile spread over his face. You haven't met your Grand Padawan, have you? He realized. Qui-Gon turned towards him, suddenly aghast at the notion of a Grand Padawan. Ben's smile grew wider. You're going to love her. Will I? She wants to master Jar-Kai Artaru. Ben turned to watch Qui-Gon's face with a deadpan expression. She's 11. Qui-Gon's burst of laughter warmed the entire room. But Femor detests Artaru, he remembered through a smile. Force give him strength, then, Ben replied, and they laughed together. The bitter taste in Ben's mouth turned, one iota at a time, into honey. You'll be glad for your help in that arena, I'm sure. The idea struck a measure of uncertainty back into Qui-Gon's expression. Perhaps I've left it too long to breach. The past matters, Qui-Gon, Ben reminded, but the future matters as well. Yes, the taller man said, ruminating on the currents of time that ran through everything that Ben touched. Things changed whenever Ben was around. The future shifted towards some unseen goal, bitter or sweet or both. Yes, of course. He smiled at his apprentice, his friend, in some unexpected way, his master. I must be more mindful of it. Ben smiled back, lifting up his shoulders under the yoke of teacher as naturally as a fish to water. To repay the favor of guidance to the man he thought of as a father was the most bittersweet sip so far. As must we all.